What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Modern video. And as we kind of wind down on some of the top tier decks like in the format for the Modern format, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about probably one of the most infamous decks and really a deck that I think players new to the format and even like some veterans just kind of gravitate towards too because of how easy the deck mulligans. It's very forgiving. It can honestly do like a lot of fun things. Like I honestly have a good time playing this deck. It's definitely not the most complicated in terms of different lines that you can take, like some other decks, but it does have a very satisfying game plan. It does very satisfying things, and it lets you cast all the big things that you really wanted to play, like when you start playing Magic, or just as like a new player in general. You want to play big spells. They're flashy. They do really powerful things, and this deck allows you to do quite literally all of that with a small downside of usually being very hard to punish even when you have like pretty decent draws. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the mono green Tron deck for the modern format. One. So here we have the mono green Tron deck piloted by Racerman, who took it to the most recent 5-0 in a modern league. But before we get into the deck and get too deep into it, I appreciate everyone who has subscribed and supported the channel. And if you have not subscribed already, please go ahead and do that. Ring the notification bell as well. It's the easiest way to support my content. It's free, takes 2 seconds, and I upload on a pretty consistent basis, at least a few videos a week, mostly going over the modern and pioneer format with some other fun like discussion type videos on there as well. Um, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at Mono Green Tron. So for people that are not familiar with Tron, the deck tries to assemble Urza's Tower, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Mine. Uh, so these lands just by themselves or with any combination of two of them on the battlefield only add one colorless mana to your mana pool. But if you control Urza's Tower, Urza's Mine, and Urza's Power Plant, Urza's Power Plant and Urza's Mine add two colorless mana, while Urza's Tower adds 3 mana to your mana pool. So essentially, if you have all three of these lands into play on turn 1, 2, and 3, you end up making 7 mana, which conveniently is enough mana to cast cards like Karn Liberated. And there is an amount of games, and I think it's probably a lot higher than people think, but a lot lower than what practice would tell you, where just playing a Karn Liberated on turn 3 on the play is just lights out. The fact that you can, take a card from your opponent's hand, kind of whatever, but you could just use this to blow up two permanents on your opponent's turn. Not even like destroy them, you exile them. So like Karn Liberated a lot of the time, like decks that maybe play like a decently low like land count, like just a turn 3 Karn Liberated blowing up a land, uh, can do a lot. And if they miss their land drop, you just have the option to tick down Karn again, blow up their other land, and pseudo lock them out of casting spells. I mean, it's super satisfying to play a Karn Liberated. It's a lot of fun, even though like Tron kind of gets like really crapped on as like this, mindless degenerate deck, and really like this deck does have some neat tricks that you can do and like some micro things that you can do to pilot the deck more efficiently and better than maybe just like what people typically think Tron is. But nonetheless, it is kind of like an easier deck, and slamming Karn Liberateds on the play are a lot of fun. Aside from that, do get to play Karn the Great Creator, and you get these cards in your sideboard that are very powerful. So Karn Liberated, obviously, activated abilities of artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. You can animate non-creature artifacts, and they get power toughness equal to their mana cost. Basically meaning that like if your opponent has like a chalice or something like that, and they're maybe locking out your 1 or 2 mana spells, Karn the Great Creator can just animate it, and because technically XX is 0 when it is on the battlefield, it just blows up the chalice. A lot of like the 0 mana things just get blown up by Karn. Um, on top of that, I believe this version is playing cards like Liquid Metal Coating, which you can turn your opponent's lands into artifacts, and you can with Karn plus on them and blow up their lands, which is something that again kind of like Karn Liberated can do, except obviously it's a little bit different because you more than likely just like play the Karn, go get Liquid Metal Coating, play the coating, and then you just stop your opponent from being able to use their lands by turning it into an artifact, and then Karn's static ability, not being able to have them activate it. And then from there, obviously, you just kind of like get the plus Karn and blow up lands and things like that. So that's pretty cool. You also have cards like Torpor Orb, which stop creatures from ETBs from creatures don't trigger. So that's kind of cool. And Snaring Bridge against like more of the aggressive decks, you're able to search for this, play it, and the fact that you just make a ton of mana and a lot of your spells don't require colored mana, just really like the Ancient Stirrings and Sylvan Scryings, you're just able to dump your whole hand, have 0 cards in hand, and there's very few decks that even have 0 power creatures. Like the Hammer decks, like a deck that you could be really in trouble against, and like Noble, the Hierarch decks, like anything playing Ignoble or Noble Hierarch. But aside from that, like Ensnaring Bridge usually kind of locks it up against a lot of the aggressive decks, at least on the creature front. Trinisphere, like a lot of like the Grixis Shadow decks, even like some of the Murktide decks and things like that. Like the fact that you just make their stuff that costs less than 3 cost 3 really like taxes their mana, because those decks can usually play like 1 or 2 cheap spells like a turn, and Trinisphere basically forces them to choose one or the other, which can definitely stunt like their game plan, because you're putting a lot of pressure just on their hand to be able to like consistently answer the threats that you're going to be playing in this deck. Um, Sundering Titan is a cool one that when it enters or leaves, you choose a land of each basic land type, and then you destroy those lands. So like a lot of times, like if you're playing against like the 3 color decks or 4 color decks, especially against like the 4 color decks, like Titan can just blow up, you know, 2, 3, 4 lands, and that just puts you super far ahead. And even when they like get to, I don't know, Solitude, your Sundering Titan. Uh, Sundering Titan doesn't need to die to trigger as well, so like you can blow up more of your opponent's lands too, which is really sweet. And of course, you gain 7 life on top of it. Just overall, like a niche card, I would say, but definitely at the same time, like puts in a lot of work. Chalice of the Void, like against like Cascade decks, Tormod's Crypt against like the Graveyard decks, Pithing Needle can just name like Yawgmoth. It can name just like anything with like an annoying activated ability that you need to stop. I believe you can even name like Hammer with this. Obviously, it doesn't stop like the auto equips and stuff like that, but like with cards like the dude that equips for free, um, or it makes equip cost of your equipment 0. Technically, I believe Pithing Needle stops that because the Hammer has equip 0, and you can't activate things, activate abilities like the Hammer and stuff like that. Um, I guess while we're here, like Nature's Claim, can just nail some like random artifacts or enchantments, like things that generally like stop like your things from doing things, which makes total sense. To Veil Summer, you can just get stuck like mulliganing to like 3 or 4 with this deck, and then like Veil of Summer is definitely a way to like on the play, or just making sure that you can resolve your spells, that you can force things through, and even like get to draw a card as well. There's a reason why they call this card 1 mana Cryptic Command, because when you play this card and it really gets your opponent, it's just like a huge blowout. Force of Vigor, best 2 for 2 in the game. At least I believe so at the current moment. Thragtusk against the aggressive decks like Burn, um, any other like big aggro decks. I mean, like it gains 5 life, and they have to basically beat this card like 3 different times. Like it's sweet. Kozilek, pulling double duty as like a card that like you can bring in against Mill, because it shuffles your graveyard back into your library along with the Kozilek. Also, just getting to cast a spell and draw 4 cards, and then just have something that's going to annihilate 4 every attack step until eventually it kills your opponent is pretty sweet. Um, so now that we finally went into the sub game of Karn the Great Creator and went through the entire sideboard just while we were there, what other big dumb things can you play with this deck? You get to play like Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, exiles 2 permanents when you cast it, so your opponent can't counter it, but like getting to blow up their 2 best permanents is pretty good. If it sticks, there's not very many things that can get rid of it. Like Solitude is like the biggest one, but again, you can gain 10 life from that. It makes it a lot harder for them to try to win. And of course, you already exiled 2 of their permanents, and then essentially taken 2 more cards from them. Like Wormcoil Engine is kind of lights out against like burn and stuff like that. Like, yeah, they could eventually throw like enough burn spells to, like blow up the Wormcoil Engine, but you still have like 2 3 3s that their creatures technically don't beat unless you cast like a few spells with like Monastery Swiftspear and things like that. Walking Ballista is another way that like this deck can just make something that's super huge and it just constantly attacks. And then if you ever have like a significant amount of counters on Walking Ballista and then you just hit your opponent with Walking Ballista, it's probably game over because then you just get to remove the rest of the counters and just kill them that way. Um, last but not least, as far as like in the threats department, Ugin the Spirit Dragon, essentially a board wipe against like colored permanents. Uh, Essentially a win condition. I mean, it gets to just dome your opponent for 3 or any target for each turn, and then in after like 2 or 3 turns of being on the battlefield, gain 7, draw 7, and put 7 permanents from your hand onto the battlefield. Even if you put a ton of lands into play, you're still just able to go threat after threat after threat. Um, and so now that we went over these threats, all the different possibilities and avenues that you have with like Karn the Great Creator and things like that, how the heck are we playing these things? So cards like Ancient Stirrings and Sylvan Scrying are essentially ways for you to find Tron lands, with Ancient Stirrings having the caveat of finding a colorless card. So your lands are colorless, so you could technically get the Blast Zone or Sanctum of Ugin or like Boseiju. On top of that, like you can grab any number of your threats, and then like any other cards that are like technically redraws in like Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star. Relic of Progenitus, I guess technically counting as like a redraw, with the caveat of like exiling itself and the graveyard. You can grab Expedition Map, which can grab any number of the lands that I just listed, or even like an Oblivion Stone if you just need a board wipe. Also, just having the option of being able to put fake counters on your permanents and eventually just blowing up the board, but then keeping some of your permanents intact. Sylvan Scrying only works for lands, but again, like the fact that you could play like a Tron lane on turn 1 and then play like a Sphere or a Star, then play a second one and then be able to cast Sylvan Scrying to find like your third piece so you can play like your Karn. The interesting thing is going to be like the Warping Whale as like rounding out the other non-creature spells in this deck. Being able to exile a creature with power or toughness 1 or less. Being at 2 mana, like you can just get rid of like if your opponent doesn't have like Bauble or anything like that, if they go like turn 2 Ledger Shredder, like Warping Whale can kill it in like response to like connive triggers and things like that. Or if they just like discard a land, if they don't grow their thing, like this can take care of it. Also, just being pretty good against like the Ornithopters and like Memnites and stuff like that. If your opponent tries to go in with like a hammer, you're able to like Warping Whale before the hammer actually equips and get rid of it that way and just leave them with a hammer on the battlefield. You can counter like sorcery spells, which I would say is a little bit more niche, but definitely a thing that you can do. Also, it's like can weirdly be like a ramp spell. Like you can just make a 1/1 with this, and then obviously it sacrifices that at colorless mana. So you can use this as like ramp to like power out like a Karn the Great Creator or something like that, or just be able to play some like your other spells and stuff like that. Like it's just mana that you have for later. It does have a power and toughness, so you could technically beat down with it if you absolutely needed to, or just use it to like trade. But you're probably using it for the first mode. But Warping Whale is just kind of like I think a free card that you can play in the deck, and it always just has something that it can do in just about any matchup. Rounding out the rest of the spells really are just the artifacts that again we kind of went over, like Sphere and Star, like basically like you filter mana through it to like create green mana. But the one thing being like Chromatic Sphere, you have to activate the ability to draw a card. If you just have a Star in play, and let's say you blow up an Oblivion Stone, stars will let you draw cards from blowing up like Oblivion Stones and stuff like that. Chromatic Spheres will not. And that's just the wording on the card. Like technically, Chromatic Star like lets you filter mana to add a mana of any color, and then as an effect of that, it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. You draw a card, but if your opponent blows it up or if you blow it up, you can draw a card. Expedition Map just finds a land. It's like another way that you can get like your third Tron piece or like another Tron piece or one of your 3 utility lands on turn 3. Typically, you can go like map, power plant, go activate, go get tower, and things like that. Relic of Prodigious good against like the graveyard decks. Obviously, can cycle itself to like draw a card if you really need to in the matchups where affecting the graveyard isn't too useful. Oblivion Stone, honestly, not like a super bad play to play on like turn 3 or whatever, and be able to like put a counter on one of your things, and then just be able to threaten to blow it up on like turn 4. Um, it's just like a main deck board wipe that the deck can play very easily and can afford essentially the 8 mana. There is some decks that play like an Oblivion Stone, like will play like an All's Dust and things like that, which I think is like totally fair. Like that's something that you could play. But like Oblivion Stone, I think a lot of the time for 1 more mana, it can just end up being better, even though you can cast All's Dust on like turn 3. Um, Finally, the lands, like I'm really gonna go over like the Sanctum of Ugin, the Boseiju, and the Blast Zone, for the fact like the rest of them are pretty simple. You obviously want 4 of each Tron land, just in case your opponent is able to blow it up like their own Boseijus or anything like that. You have multiple copies that you can go and get. Sanctum of Ugin, you cast a color spell with convert mana cost 7 or greater, and yes, if you cast a Walking Ballista X equaling 4, you will trigger like Sanctum of Ugin. You can then go search your library for a colorless creature card, put into your hand, which of course a lot of the time ends up getting like Ulamog, and of course matchup dependent. Like you could just end up getting like a Wormcoil Engine against like some more aggressive decks, or you can go and get like Walking Ballista to really kind of put it to your opponent. Because again, like more than likely you'll have enough mana to have this come into play with at least 4 counters on it, and at that point, it's becoming like a 5/5 and a 6/6, and so on and so on. It ends up just tearing up the game. Um, Beseiju, another way that like you can interact like in the Tron mirrors, like obviously, uh, if you're just able to play like a Sphere or a Star on turn 1, and then play like a second Tron land, and then like Beseiju your opponent's land. Like you can just easily like naturally draw like the third Tron piece. Like the consistency that this deck has through playing like Sphere Star Map and then getting to play Ancient Stirrings and Sylvan Scrying is just wicked, and you'll be surprised the amount of times that like you'll mulligan with this deck and you'll go to like 3 or 4 cards in hand, and you're just able to still have turn 3 Tron and find a payoff for all that mana. Obviously, ideal to keep 7 and 6s, but like this deck does mulligan very well, and you are encouraged to mulligan very aggressively in like game ones for hands that just do something. If you can get a read on your opponent and obviously figure out what they're playing turn 1, then you can mulligan kind of with that knowledge. But really going in truly blind, like this deck, you are willing to mulligan to like a very low amount of cards in hand just to find a hand that does something. Like if like a 7 card hand doesn't get like turn 3 Tron uh pretty reliably, in the sense that like if you can guarantee turn 3 Tron with like your 7 card hand, you're pretty inclined to keep it. If it doesn't, then you're inclined to mulligan a lot of the time. Finally, I guess real quick, Blast Zone. Blast Zone is just a card that like you can basically deal with like whatever subset of permanents you want. Uh, Very easily that you could like even get this up to like kill a Murktide, if that's your thing. Um, and just like a very good utility land. Like I'm sure there's other like lands you could play like in place of Blast Zone, but Blast Zone's probably a pretty fine inclusion for the deck. Uh, so that's Mono Green Tron for Modern. Pretty long-winded for a deck that is pretty simple. Like you do want to just assemble Mine, Power Plant, Tower, and start playing big things. Um, the little optimizations that you can make when playing the deck is just mulliganing aggressively, uh, just basically being very greedy, honestly, with like your 7 and 6s, and maybe getting a little bit looser when you get to 5 and 4 cards. Um, any hands that like can make turn 3 Tron are essentially keepable, because eventually you will draw something that either is going to draw you more cards, like these cards here, let you dig deeper into the deck, like with Ancient Stirrings, or you're one of your actual threats. There's some like percentages I'm sure someone has done, but like I know like when uh my wife played this deck, and like when I was like trying it out, you definitely hit turn 3 Tron and find a threat on like turn 3 or turn 4. Just a lot more than honestly you would expect with a deck that does want to mulligan fairly aggressively. So if you enjoy this deck tech and you want to see more stuff like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some past videos as well. I've done basically at least one video on just about every playable modern deck in the format, minus like a few of them. There's some that I want to get to, but is what it is. I have in mind a deck that I want to look over next week, that I think will kind of like round it out. So that's going to be kind of cool. Of course, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you know when new videos go up. I appreciate everyone for the support and just keeps making me want to make videos and stuff like that. Like I enjoy doing this. It is a lot of fun. I feel like it makes me better as a player, and anything I can do to help other players get better is always just cool with me. So thank you everyone for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next video.